A door left half open, an invitation or a trap. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Hearing from you all makes this journey even more special. Now let's begin. It had been raining since dawn, a thin drizzle that never seemed to end, soft enough to be ignored but persistent enough to settle into the bones. Maigret sat by the kitchen table in his apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, a heavy pipe between his fingers, though he had not yet lit it. Madame Maigret moved quietly about the kitchen, her movements as familiar to him as the ticking of the clock on the wall. She placed a small plate of bread and butter beside his coffee, as she always did, without comment. He nodded in thanks, his mind elsewhere. There was no pressing case that morning, no telegrams demanding his presence. He ought to have enjoyed the idleness, yet he found himself staring through the rain-smeared glass at the blurred outlines of the trees along the boulevard, his thoughts circling something he could not quite name. It was not unusual. Often a mood settled over him before the matter itself arrived. The telephone rang, its dull tone carrying across the apartment. He made no move at first, watching his wife wipe her hands on her apron and glance toward him. He rose with a small sigh and answered. A voice from the prefecture. Nothing urgent, they assured him, but something odd. A concierge from a boarding house on Rue de Turenne had telephoned the local station in agitation. A tenant, a woman who lived alone, had left her door ajar when she went out the previous evening. It was still ajar in the morning, though the woman had not returned. The neighbors were uneasy. It was hardly a crime, hardly even a matter for the police. Yet someone thought perhaps Maigret should hear of it. He hung up, the receiver heavy in his hand. Madame Maigret looked at him expectantly. Nothing, he said after a pause, though the word felt untrue. Only a small matter. He pushed the bread across his plate, appetite gone. He knew well enough that doors were left open every day in Paris from forgetfulness or carelessness. Yet something in the tone of the report, the nervous concierge, the unease of neighbors, had caught him. He had learned never to ignore such small disturbances. Beneath them, life often concealed its disorder. By late morning, the rain had grown heavier, drumming against the umbrella he carried as he walked slowly toward the Marais. He did not rush. The case, if it was one, would not escape. A tram clattered past. A man under a doorway raised his collar against the damp. Maigret walked on, the smells of wet pavement, roasting chestnuts from a cart, and the faint, acrid smoke of coal fires blending into the air. Rue de Turenne was quiet, its buildings a little worn, respectable enough but never elegant. The boarding house stood between a bakery and a shuttered tailor's shop, the entrance dark and narrow, the nameplate dull with age. He paused beneath the dripping awning, watching a woman in a raincoat hurry past without a glance, before stepping inside. The concierge, a thin man with rheumy eyes, greeted him with a nervous bob of the head. His hands smelled faintly of onions. He explained at once. The tenant, a woman of 40 or so, worked in a small office nearby. She was punctual, orderly. She always locked her door. But last night, the concierge made a helpless gesture. She had gone out after supper, leaving the door half open as if she had meant to return. Only she had not. Maigret climbed the stairs slowly, his heavy steps echoing in the stairwell. The door in question stood at the end of the corridor, indeed ajar by a hand's width, the shadows within deep and uncertain. He waited a moment, pipe clenched between his teeth, listening. Only the faint drip of water somewhere above, and the muffled hum of traffic through the rain. He pushed the door open with one large hand. The room revealed itself in fragments. A small table, a tidy bed, a wardrobe slightly out of alignment. Nothing overturned, no signs of struggle. Yet the air carried that peculiar stillness, as though someone had been present not long ago. A cup with a trace of coffee stood on the table, its surface filmed over. A silk scarf lay draped across a chair, as if dropped carelessly. He did not move farther inside at once. Instead, he stood in the doorway, filling the silence with his bulk, as though waiting for the room itself to tell him what had happened. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, unease gathered around him. The woman who lived here had not simply forgotten her door. Something in the air, in the quiet arrangement of objects, suggested interruption. A life paused mid-gesture. Maigret lit his pipe at last, the match flaring briefly in the dim room. He drew in the smoke, let it curl out again, and felt the weight of the rain pressing in from outside. It was only a door left half open, yet already he knew he would not let it go. He stood a long while in the doorway as if the room might change its mind and tell him something. The pipe went out between his teeth. He relit it and let the smoke do its slow work. A damp thread of air moved from the corridor, bringing with it the smell of cabbage from someone's noon pot and the darker odor of old wood that had known too much scrubbing. On the small table the cup's skin had thickened, and a spoon lay beside it perfectly clean, as if wiped and placed just so. There was a small gas ring near the window with a dented saucepan on it. The bedspread was pulled tight. The pillow carried a faint oval of powder. On a chair, the silk scarf, pale blue, had a crease across it, as if a hand had gripped it for a second before letting it fall. He went in, making no effort to avoid sounding heavy. A man like him didn't belong in rooms like this, and it never helped to pretend otherwise. He looked for the ordinary things first, the little routines that, when disturbed, spoke louder than cries. A narrow wardrobe, one hinge squeaking. Inside, 2 dresses in sober shades, a lighter summer dress with the waist let out and taken in again by an uncertain hand, a worn cardigan. A coat, dark brown, hung on the inner hook. The pockets were flat. On the floor, a pair of black shoes with a modest heel stood heel to wall. Near the door there was space where another pair might be put, but he saw only a pair of house slippers under the bed. In the corner, a folded umbrella leaned against the skirting board, stout with a wooden crook, and he looked at it a long moment because the rain had not stopped since dawn. He went to the window and opened it. The rain tapped at the sill and made a thin glitter on the iron railing outside. From somewhere in the courtyard, a woman laughed briefly, then coughed. He closed the window again. On the narrow mantel there was a postcard of Etretat, propped against a looking-glass, the chalk cliffs faded by sun that this room rarely saw. The card wasn't written on. Beside it a small alarm clock, hardly ticking, its hands at 11. He listened, decided it had run down and been pushed without care to the correct hour days ago. A box of matches lay next to the clock, the kind one got free at cafes. The paper was softened by damp. He turned it in his palm. Café du Renard, Place des Vosges. Someone had drawn a little cross in pencil in the corner of the fox's printed tail. The concierge hovered in the hall and, when Maigret looked up, crept 2 steps inside as if afraid the room might accuse him of curiosity. "What is her name?" Maigret asked. "Vasseur. Mademoiselle Claire Vasseur." The man's eyelids wept a little. He dabbed them with the corner of a handkerchief he had already abused. "She's not a troublemaker. Quiet as anything. I told the sergeant it's only that she left the door like that. Half open. People don't like it. At night, you see." "How long has she lived here?" 3 years. 4, perhaps. She pays on the dot the first Monday. Works nearby, Rue du Parc Royal. An office with a brass plate. Le Duc et Frères, something with invoices. He shrugged. "She doesn't waste words, mademoiselle. Not unfriendly. Careful. Friends." The concierge made a face that wanted to be helpful and failed. "You know the sort. A sister once, I think, or a cousin. There was a package near Christmas. But visitors, no. Once every 2 months, perhaps. A man once, in a grey overcoat, looking up at the numbers on the doors as if he didn't trust them. That was weeks ago. He left in 10 minutes. She walked him down. She didn't smile. She smoke. Number never seen her buy tobacco. Always has matches anyway. She cooks on the ring. Last night? The concierge's fingers worried each other, twisted like damp cloth. I was in the lodge. It's my rheumatism. The damp goes to the knee. The walls are thin. One lives in people's noises. She came up at 7, or near enough. She always comes at 7:10 or 7:15. She takes off her shoes in the hall before going in. Then at 9, perhaps 10 to, I heard her open again and go down. You know how some doors speak. Hers did not close. I waited because one mustn't poke into tenants' affairs. At 11, the door was still like that. At midnight, I thought of closing it, but my wife, she's the careful one, said no. In the morning, it was as you see. You saw her go down. No, only the steps and the latch. She walked softly. He let the words settle. There was a damp mark on the wallpaper by the window at shoulder height in the approximate shape of a leaf. On the table, beneath the cup, a square of paper protected the wood. The corner of an envelope torn and pressed flat. He didn't lift it yet. He walked the small rectangle of floor, stopped by the umbrella again. She has another, he asked. Another umbrella? Yes. The concierge blinked several times while he thought. In the spring, she had a small one with a snap. That was a year ago. I haven't seen it lately. Keys. On a string in her bag. She always turns it twice. I hear it. Twice. Maigret nodded, went back to the table, and now lifted the square of envelope. The flap had been cut cleanly. The return address, what remained of it, was a stamp from Saint-Mandé. In the waste paper basket there was nothing but a twist of butcher's paper and a strip torn from a newspaper listing cinema times. He left them. He went out into the hall and knocked at the nearest door. An old woman answered with her corset half-laced and a look that had been pinched by years of minding other people's business. Madame Borel, she announced herself without being asked, widow of a schoolteacher, the building's true memory. She would have had plenty to tell, even if there had been nothing to tell. Mademoiselle Vasseur, Maigret said gently. She's a neat one, Madame Borel said at once, as if this were already suspicious. Always the same hat, eats her soup at the same time. She washes her stockings on Thursdays and hangs them by the stove, not in the courtyard. Not like some. Yesterday she passed with her collar turned up, and she looked at me. But through me, you know. She didn't say good evening. That's not like her, not exactly. Visitors? The man in the grey coat, the old woman said, triumphant at having a fact. Once. He smelled like hair oil. Voices? Last night. There was a voice. She admitted. Less sure. Downstairs, perhaps. Or in the street. A man's voice that didn't travel well, like someone trying not to be heard. It could have been the radio in the concierge's lodge. He puts it too low, and what you get is a kind of whispering. He thanked her, and she stepped into the doorway farther, her eyes crawling down the corridor as if to pick up crumbs of additional story, and finding none, retreated with the particular dignity of the useless. On the next landing, a door stood ajar. Not half open, simply careless. A baby slept inside. The mother, a girl with a chapped mouth, said she had thought Mademoiselle Vasseur too smart for the street in a way. She had once seen her on a Sunday with lipstick. Not much, just the idea of it, and a new pair of gloves. She was going toward the square, the girl said. Place des Vosges. It's where people walk who want to look at trees without getting wet. He stopped by the bakery on the way out. The place was warm and smelled like a promise. Flour dust glazed the window. Madame Rigal, round and powdered as if she'd been dipped in her own wares, remembered everyone and everything with a pleasant malice. Mademoiselle Vasseur, she said, not needing to think. Half a loaf, 3 slices of ham from the shop across, and yesterday a brioche, which she never takes. She put the change down and counted it, but she wasn't looking. Her eyes were somewhere outside. She asked for matches. I said, "You don't smoke." She said, "They're not for me." Then she smiled to make it less strange. Was she alone? Always. If she's with anyone, they wait outside. Not a woman to make scenes, that one. But she did have new shoes last week, the sort you buy after standing too long at a desk. Outside, the drizzle had thinned to a mist that touched the face like breath. He stood under the shop's small awning and looked at the frontage of the house again. The tailor's shutters, the crooked number over the doorway, the line of bells by the jamb with one missing. He thought of the umbrella upstairs and felt it as a weight in the corner of his mind. People forgot keys, they forgot letters, they even forgot to eat. In Paris, on a wet night, one did not forget one's umbrella, unless one did not mean to belong. At the corner, a police van idled, boiling exhaust. A patrolman in a cape recognized him and nudged his cap down out of respect. "Chief," he said, "you're out in weather for doors now." "Sometimes doors are enough," Maigret said without irony. He crossed to the little square where the chestnut seller had set up despite the damp. The packets steamed in their paper. He bought one and stood, eating slowly, looking at nothing until what he was looking at appeared. The Café du Renard wasn't far. He could see the first edge of the Place des Vosges from where he stood, the red brick washed to a deeper tone by the weather, arcades sheltering figures that moved without haste. He put a chestnut into his mouth and felt the sweetness in the powder collapse together. Matches with a fox, a penciled cross in the tail. It would have been nothing for some, but these small marks traveled in the pockets of lonely people, as if they were receipts for time. He went back into the house to the room and sat in her chair. He removed his hat. A string of water fell from the brim to the floor with a sound like patience. He filled his pipe again and didn't light it. If she came back, she would see the shape of a large man in her place, and perhaps she would give herself away by the way she stopped, or by the way she went on as if she had expected him. He could have sent for a man from the local post to take turns watching, but he preferred his own silence to that of others. Silence could be different in each body. His was heavy and simple and had a way of making rooms resume their proper behavior. On the table, under the cup, the square of envelope wanted to be noticed again, and he let it. Saint-Mandé. Not far. Near the Vincennes, woods where, on Sundays, respectable people went to breathe and to be briefly someone else. A brioche, bought by a woman who did not eat brioche. Matches for no one, a door that had not decided whether it was open or closed. He thought of Madame Maigret, of her way of placing the bread exactly beside the coffee. Order made a kind of nest for worry. Sometimes people built it higher when they were preparing to fly. In the hall there was a footfall, stopped, went on. He waited, not turning his head. The concierge coughed into his hand and whispered with someone. Another tenant, perhaps. The building swallowed it. He listened for the sound of a woman who walked softly and turned her key twice, and when he did not hear it, he lifted the matchbox again and let the fox look back at him. He could go now to the cafe and show the card and be told nothing of value by a waiter with a cloth over his arm. But not yet. The room still had something in it that did not belong to him and did not belong to her either, and until it faded, he would not move. By mid-afternoon the rain was steadier. Drops crawled across the pane like insects. He rose and, almost without thinking, adjusted the wardrobe so the hinge would not squeak. It was a useless gesture, and he knew it, but the quiet suited the place. He placed the scarf back on the chair where he had found it, corrected by a finger the crease that spoke of a hand that had hesitated. Then he took the umbrella from the corner and set it upright by the door, where one would reach for it on the way out. He stood back, as if arranging a small scene in a theater with a single actor, and he felt the little click inside himself that meant direction had appeared. He left the room as he had found it, half open. In the lodge, he told the concierge almost nothing and asked almost nothing more. "If she returns," he said, "let her find everything as it was." The man nodded eagerly, relieved to have precise instructions for his nerves. On Rue de Turenne, the light had flattened to the color of pewter. He turned his collar up and set off toward the arcades of the Place des Vosges with the even, unhurried gait of a man who had decided to be patient with the city until it answered him in its own time. He did not yet know whether there had been a crime, only that somewhere between a brioche, a box of matches, and a door that could not make up its mind, a life had hesitated long enough to be seen, and for now, seeing would have to be enough. The rain had thickened to a steady sheet by the time Maigret reached the arcades of the Place des Vosges. The square always had the air of a stage set, its ordered facades and clipped trees suggesting a Paris that wanted to be admired rather than lived in. Yet beneath the arches, people hurried, collars turned up, hats dripping, the sound of shoes slapping stone echoing in a rhythm that was almost mournful. Maigret slowed his steps, pipe between his teeth, watching faces without seeming to watch them. Couples walked close together, a child dragged reluctantly behind a nursemaid. Two men argued in low voices outside a tobacconist. The drizzle blurred everything, gave it a sheen of secrecy. He found the Café du Renard tucked at the corner, its awning sagging with water. Inside, the air was thick with damp wool and the sweet-sour smell of beer poured too often and wiped away too rarely. He paused in the doorway, shaking droplets from his hat, letting his eyes adjust. It was half full. Clerks finishing lunch, a delivery man nursing a glass of wine, two women with tired eyes whispering over coffee. No one looked up when he entered, which was always a sign that something could be learned. Places where people stared too eagerly rarely held truths worth keeping. The waiter, a young man with a pale face and slicked hair, came with the practiced shuffle of someone who had learned not to expect generous tips. Maigret ordered a glass of white wine and, when it arrived, set the box of matches on the table with a kind of absent-mindedness. The waiter's eyes fell on it, flickered, then retreated politely. "Busy last night?" Maigret asked in the tone of a man making weather talk. The waiter shrugged. "Not more than usual. The rain keeps people home." Maigret nodded, letting silence draw out. He struck a match and lit his pipe. The flame trembled in the draught from the door. He let the smoke drift, eyes half-lidded, as if the conversation already bored him. People were easier when they thought they were unobserved. "Many come here from Rue de Turenne," he added, almost idly. The waiter hesitated, then pretended to adjust the glasses on his tray. "Some. Office workers mostly. Residents sometimes. Not many women alone." "And those who do?" The young man glanced at the matchbox again. There was one. "Perhaps she's the one you mean. A quiet type. She'd sit by the window. A coffee. Sometimes a glass of cure. She never stayed long, but she always took matches." "Why?" The waiter lifted his thin shoulders. "Habit. A gesture. Some like to leave with something in their pocket. Perhaps she collected them. Perhaps she liked the fox." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "She put a mark on one once, I noticed. Just with a pencil. Strange, but one sees stranger things." Maigret let the silence grow again, the smoke filling it. He sipped the wine. The cafe sounds swelled around him. Cutlery on plates, a chair scraping, the hiss of the coffee machine. "She was here last night?" he asked finally. The waiter shifted. "Yes, for a short while. 9:30. She sat at her usual place, window to the square. She ordered coffee but left it half. She seemed, I don't know, not herself, nervous. She looked toward the door as if expecting someone. Then a man came. Grey coat, tall, thin. He sat with her 10 minutes, no more. They did not touch. They did not raise their voices. When he left, she stayed a little, then went too. Did she seem afraid? the waiter thought, then shook his head slowly. Not afraid. Tired, perhaps. Resigned. As if she knew something she didn't like, but couldn't change. The details settled heavily in Maigret's mind, like a stone at the bottom of water. He drew at his pipe, watching the waiter retreat to tend another table. A woman who always shut her door twice had left it open. A woman who never bought brioche had bought one. A woman who never wasted words had sat in silence with a man for 10 minutes. He felt the shape of something forming, though it was still only mist. He left money for the wine and stepped back into the rain. The sky was low, the arcades echoing with footsteps. For a moment he stood, collar up, watching the place where she had sat, though, of course, there was no trace. Then he set off down Rue du Parc Royal, where the concierge had said she worked. The offices of Le Duc et Frères occupied the second floor of a grey building that smelled of damp files. The brass plate on the door had dulled. Inside, a woman with spectacles perched on the edge of her nose looked up from a ledger with mild irritation. She was in her 50s, hair pulled tight, the sort who measured out her life in columns of figures. "Mademoiselle Vasseur?" Maigret asked. "She has not come today," the woman replied at once, as if this were already an inconvenience. "Unusual. She is punctual, very punctual." "What does she do here?" "Typing, filing, correspondence. She has a steady hand, reliable. We value that. She is not talkative, but one doesn't pay for talk." "Friends here?" The woman sniffed. "We are colleagues." "That is different. She keeps to herself. No nonsense. Once she mentioned a sister in Saint-Mandé, but not in detail." "Did anyone visit her here?" The woman hesitated, her fingers worrying the edge of the ledger. "There was a man. Weeks ago. He waited in the corridor. Tall, grey coat. I did not like the look of him. She went pale when she saw him. She said they would speak outside. She returned later, said nothing." Maigret let his gaze rest on her until she looked away. "What kind of pale?" he asked softly. The woman frowned. "As if she had swallowed something sharp. That is the best I can say." He thanked her and left, his boots echoing on the stone stairs. The air outside seemed heavier, the drizzle thicker. He paused under the dripping eaves of a doorway, pipe unlit in his hand, and thought. A woman precise, orderly, careful, suddenly careless. A man who appeared like a shadow, never staying long. A sister in Saint-Mandé. He took a cab east, the streets shining with rain, trams clattering past, umbrellas huddled at corners. Saint-Mandé was quieter, almost suburban, its streets lined with modest houses and plane trees dripping water. He asked for the Vasseur residence and was directed to a narrow house with shutters drawn. A woman opened the door, younger than Claire by perhaps 5 years, hair in disorder, apron stained with flour. "Yes?" she said, defensive at once. "Inspector Maigret, I'd like to ask about your sister." The woman's face closed as if against a gust of wind. "Claire, what has she done?" "Nothing. She has not been seen since last night." The younger woman bit her lip, then stepped aside reluctantly. Inside, the house smelled of bread and damp wool. Children's shoes lay by the wall. "She comes rarely," the woman said, her voice taut. "We write sometimes, not often. She is private. She does not speak of her life." "When did you last see her?" "A month ago. She came on a Sunday. She brought cakes. She was quiet, tired. I asked if she was ill. She said no, only work." "Did she mention anyone?" The sister looked at him quickly, then away. "Perhaps. A man. She did not say his name, only that she must settle something. She did not look happy." "What kind of man?" "I don't know. She would not say, but she said once, long ago, that she had made a mistake she could not correct. I thought it was nothing, a foolish remark, but she said it again last month. Exactly the same words." The children burst into the room then, laughing, chasing each other, and the woman hushed them sharply. Maigret stood, heavy, thoughtful. He thanked her and stepped back into the wet street. The rain was thinning now, though the clouds remained. He lit his pipe and walked slowly toward the tram stop, water streaming in the gutters. He thought of the words repeated, a mistake she could not correct, of a man in a grey coat who appeared in doorways and corridors, never staying long, of a woman who lived her life in order until suddenly, one night, she did not. The tram rattled him back toward the city. In the window's reflection, his own face looked older, more tired, blurred by drops of rain. He thought of his wife at home, perhaps already preparing supper, placing the bread beside the plate as she always did. He thought of the umbrella leaning in the corner of a small, silent room, and he knew that the door half open was not an accident, not even carelessness. It was the crack through which her life had slipped, leaving only questions and silence behind. For now, silence was enough. But not for long. The tram left him near Bastille, and from there Maigret walked the short distance back toward Rue de Turenne. He did not hurry. The drizzle had eased into a light mist that clung to coats and softened the edges of buildings, making Paris appear both smaller and more secretive. His pipe burned low, the stem resting loosely between his teeth, and he walked with a heavy patience that had become his way of sifting facts. He was not yet sure there had been a crime. He was not even sure that the woman had disappeared of her own will or against it. But the unease remained. The same unease that had caught at him in the apartment, in the matches with their penciled mark, in the way the sister had spoken of a mistake that could not be corrected. At the corner near the boarding house, he paused beneath the arch of a doorway. Across the street, the entrance to the house looked just as it had before, the number crooked above the lintel, the door dark with damp, the concierge's window lit weakly by a lamp. People passed by without a glance, hurrying home to warm food and light. He watched until the rhythm of the place felt steady again, then crossed and entered. The concierge rose at once from his stool, eager. "No sign, Chief Inspector." "No sound either. My wife swears she heard a step in the hall, but it was nothing. These walls are full of echoes." Maigret nodded, said nothing. He went upstairs, the steps groaning under his weight, and once more stood in the doorway of Claire Vasseur's room. The door was still half open, just as he had left it, and inside the umbrella waited against the wall like a sentinel. He entered, sat again in her chair, and filled his pipe. The small room received him with its silence, and he let it. There was something here that resisted haste. He stayed nearly an hour, the pipe smoke gathering in the corners, his thoughts circling. He considered the sister's words, a mistake she could not correct. He considered the man in the grey coat appearing at the cafe, at the office, always briefly, always leaving her subdued. And he considered the small betrayals of her routine, the brioche, the matches, the door. People rarely broke their own habits unless something pressed hard against them. At length, he rose, locked the room with a spare key from the concierge, and instructed that it should remain untouched. Then he stepped back into the wet street and turned toward the Quai des Orfèvres. The office was warm with stale air and the smell of paper. He hung his coat on the peg, set his hat heavily on the desk, and allowed his shoulders to sink into the familiar creak of his chair. Lucas, one of his inspectors, looked up from a pile of reports. "You've got something?" Lucas asked. "Perhaps," Maigret said. "A woman missing, or perhaps only absent. But there is a man, grey coat, tall, thin. We'll want to know him." Lucas grunted. "Description enough to find 10,000. "Fewer, if he leaves his mark," Maigret replied mildly. He told Lucas about the cafe, the office, the sister in Saint-Mandé. Lucas took notes, frowning, though he knew as well as anyone that Maigret's notes were not facts but impressions, to be tested against silence and time. "Put l'oignon on it," Maigret said finally. He'll complain, but he'll see something we don't. Have him ask discreetly in the cafes around Place des Vosges. A tall man in a grey coat. No need to hurry him. Lucas smiled faintly. Lognon never hurries. He suffers. That may be useful, Maigret said. He left the office again near evening. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining under the lamps. He walked toward home, the air cool against his face. Madame Maigret had set the table. The smell of stew drifted from the kitchen. He ate slowly, listening to her quiet remarks about the grocer, the neighbor, the weather. At one point she said, half to herself, "It is a strange thing, leaving a door open. It is like leaving one's life half undone." He looked at her, pipe in hand, but did not comment. Later, as he sat in his armchair with a glass of beer, the words repeated themselves in his head. Half undone. The next morning he returned to Rue de Turenne. The street was brighter now, washed clean by the rain, though the air carried a sharp chill. The bakery was already open, steam fogging the windows, and Madame Rigal nodded to him from behind her loaves. He climbed the stairs again, slow and heavy. This time he knocked first at Madame Borel's door. She opened at once, eager, as if she had been waiting for him. "She has not come back," the widow said triumphantly, though there was a trace of worry in her eyes. "Not a sound, not a step. The scarf is still where you placed it, is it not?" "It is," Maigret said. He let her talk, her words spilling out about the unnaturalness of it, the disturbance in the building's rhythm. He listened without interruption, because in such floods of speech truth often slipped in unnoticed. At last, she said, she was always the careful sort. Too careful, perhaps. People who are too careful are the ones who surprise you. They break suddenly. He nodded, thanked her, and moved on. He visited the young mother with the baby, asked casually about the night before, but she had heard nothing. Then he descended to the concierge's lodge. "There was a letter," the man said suddenly, eyes darting. "I remembered after you left, weeks ago. A thick envelope, foreign stamp. She signed for it. I did not see from whom." "Foreign?" "Yes, Belgium, I think. Or Holland. The stamp was blue." Maigret said nothing, but a slow heaviness settled deeper in him. Foreign letters, a grey-coated man, a sister speaking of mistakes. He walked again to the Place des Vosges, pausing by the café. The same waiter was there, polishing glasses without conviction. "She received letters here?" Maigret asked, setting the matchbox once more on the table. The waiter shook his head. "Not that I know, but once she seemed to be waiting for something. A delivery, perhaps. She asked me if anyone had inquired for her. I said no. She looked disappointed, or perhaps relieved." The pattern was still mist without outline. He paid for his wine, stood beneath the arcades, and let his gaze travel across the square. A man in a grey coat could walk there without notice, blending with 100 others. Yet someone always remembered something. A gesture, a hesitation, the way two people did not look at each other when they should have. He would wait. He would watch. And when the silence cracked, it would tell him the rest. That night in his apartment, he told Madame Maigret only that he had walked much in the rain. She poured him beer, sat across from him, and said nothing more. He felt the quiet of the room like a balm, even as the unease of the half-open door persisted in his mind. It was not yet a case, but it would be. He had only to wait for the city to deliver its secret. The following morning, Maigret arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres, earlier than usual, his heavy steps echoing on the stairwell tiles, still damp from the cleaner's mop. The building smelled of coal smoke and ink, and the window in his office looked out onto a pale, washed sky. He stood a while at the glass, pipe unlit, letting his mind wander back over the last 2 days. The case, if it was a case, had still not settled into shape. There was only the absence of a woman who usually kept to her habits, and the faint trace of a man who never stayed. Yet he had learned long ago that mysteries often began not with a crime, but with a silence too sharp to ignore. Lucas came in with the morning's papers tucked under his arm. "Lognon sent word," he said without preamble, setting them on the desk. He grumbled as always, but he found something. Maigret grunted, easing himself into his chair. What did he find, apart from rheumatism? Lucas allowed himself a smile. The waiter at another cafe near the square remembered a man in a grey coat, tall, stooped a little. He asked questions, wanted to know if a certain woman came there often. "The description fits your Mademoiselle Vasseur." Maigret lit his pipe at last, the flame catching with a faint hiss. Smoke filled the room slowly. "So he was looking for her," he murmured, "or making sure others were looking. And she knew it." "There's more," Lucas said, flipping a page of his notes. Lognon spoke with a tobacconist near Rue Saint-Antoine. He remembered selling the man a packet of cigarettes, Dutch brand. Rare here. He paid with a note too large for the purchase. The tobacconist thought it odd, but the man had gone before he could remark on it. Dutch cigarettes, foreign. Letters, a sister speaking of mistakes. The threads still did not tie together, but they pressed insistently. Maigret leaned back, pipe stem between his teeth, eyes narrowed. "Find out what you can about her employer," he said. "Le Duc et Frères, who they deal with, where their correspondence goes. Quietly. And keep Lognon at his grumbling. He sees what others overlook because he believes the world conspires against him. Perhaps, in this case, it does." By late morning, Maigret was once again in Rue de Turenne. The boarding house looked no different, its door worn smooth by 100 hands. Inside, the concierge jumped to attention, his rheumy eyes anxious. "No sign, Chief Inspector," he said quickly. "I've watched all night, all morning. Nothing." The air of the house was thick with cooking smells and damp wool drying on banisters. Maigret climbed the stairs without replying and once more entered the small room. He sat heavily in the chair, pipe between his fingers, and stared at the umbrella still leaning against the wall. The scarf on the chair had not moved, nor the cup on the table. The silence seemed to have grown heavier, as if the absence had settled deeper into the walls. After some time he rose and crossed to the wardrobe. He studied the dresses again, the cardigan, the coat. He reached into the pocket of the coat and this time drew out a crumpled tram ticket, Saint-Mandé to Bastille. The ink was blurred but recent. She had traveled the same route he had taken to see her sister, perhaps days earlier. He placed it back carefully, closed the wardrobe, and turned again to the mantel where the postcard of Étretat leaned. A seaside place, far from Paris. A dream of cliffs and water for a woman whose life was narrow corridors and typewritten pages. He heard footsteps on the stair and the low voice of Madame Borel drifting from her door. He ignored it. He was not yet ready for her chatter. Instead, he struck a match, drew in smoke, and let his mind turn over what was known. A careful woman, disturbed habits, a man of grey, foreign traces, a sister aware of a mistake. No violence yet, no body, only a door ajar, but the weight of it was undeniable. He left the building and walked again to the Place des Vosges. The square was brighter now, sunlight diffused through thinning clouds. Children played under the arcades, their cries echoing. The Café du Renard was less crowded, a few tables empty. The same waiter looked up as Maigret entered, eyes flicking nervously toward the matchbox in his hand. "She did not come again," the waiter said before Maigret had spoken, "nor the man. But someone asked after them, a man with a hat pulled low. He wanted to know if she was seen often. I told him nothing. I didn't like his manner." "Describe him." "Not tall, stocky, mustache. A stranger, not like the other one. Foreign also, I think. His French was careful, too careful." Maigret nodded, left money on the table and, walked slowly out. The air of the square seemed suddenly colder despite the sun. Two men, perhaps linked, perhaps not. One tall and grey, one stocky and cautious, and a woman between them who had said she made a mistake. He did not return to the Quai des Orfèvres at once. Instead, he walked slowly through the Marais, past damp courtyards and narrow passages. He let the city speak to him in fragments, the slap of laundry on a line, the hiss of a street vendor's pan, the mutter of a drunk outside a cafe. Each detail was ordinary, yet together they gave texture to the mystery that was still only half seen. By the time he reached the river, evening was near. Lights glimmered on the water, reflections broken by ripples. He stood on the Pont Marie, pipe gone out, and leaned on the stone parapet. A barge moved beneath, slow and heavy, its lanterns glowing faintly. He thought of the umbrella again, waiting in the corner of the room. No one forgot an umbrella in Paris rain, unless one left with the certainty of not returning. That night at home, Madame Maigret served him boiled beef with vegetables. He ate quietly, lost in thought. At last she said, almost casually, "It is strange. People think mistakes can be hidden, but mistakes are like stains. Even when you scrub them, they show through." He looked at her, heavy face impassive, but the words lodged in him. After supper, he sat by the window, pipe in hand, and watched the lights on Boulevard Richard Lenoir blur through the mist. The case was still only a shadow, but the shadow had grown denser, and soon it would demand to be named. The next day, he would go back to Leduc et Frères. Paper trails could be more revealing than blood. And somewhere, among the ledgers and invoices, the reason for Claire Vasseur's open door might begin to take shape. The following morning, Maigret made his way once more to Rue du Parc Royal, his collar turned up against the wind that had replaced the rain. The streets were drying, but the air carried the faint scent of sodden leaves and damp stone, a smell that lingered after days of drizzle. His pipe burned slowly, the stem clenched loosely between his teeth as he walked without haste, the way he always did when he meant to observe more than act. The brass plate of Leduc et Frères caught a glint of weak light, the letters dulled by years of hands brushing against them. Inside, the office smelled of paper, ink and coal dust from the small stove in the corner. The spectacled woman who had spoken with him before looked up with her same air of mild annoyance, though it flickered this time into something closer to concern. "She has still not come," she said without waiting for him to ask. "It is not like her. Monsieur le Duc himself is irritated. He does not like disruption." "Where is Monsieur le Duc?" Maigret asked. "In the back, dictating." The man appeared moments later, a stout figure with a bristling mustache and the slightly harried look of someone accustomed to balancing accounts more than people. He greeted Maigret politely, though with the reserve of a businessman who feared entanglement. "Mademoiselle Vasseur has not reported," Maigret said. "I am aware," Leduc replied with a clipped tone. "Reliable woman, quiet, never late. It is inconvenient, but perhaps she is unwell." "Has she received correspondence here? Letters, packages?" Leduc hesitated, fingers drumming on his desk. "Some letters. Ordinary business. Nothing unusual." "You are certain?" The man's eyes shifted slightly, then returned to Maigret's steady gaze. "There was once an envelope. Thick. Foreign. From Antwerp, if I recall. I thought it was personal. She did not open it here." "Antwerp," Maigret repeated softly, the smoke curling from his pipe. "Do you know whom it was from?" Leduc shook his head briskly. "It was not my affair. She was discreet, a good worker. I did not pry." "Did anyone ever come to see her?" "A man, some weeks ago. Tall, thin, grey coat. I did not care for him. He did not enter my office. He waited in the corridor. She looked pale when she saw him, but she said nothing, and I did not ask. We have work to do here. We are not a gossiping household." The words were meant to close the subject, but they only confirmed what Maigret already knew. The presence of the man was more than chance. Foreign letters, a Dutch cigarette, Antwerp, threads beginning to gather. He thanked Leduc without pressing further and stepped back into the street. The sky had cleared slightly, and the sound of a tram bell carried on the air. He walked slowly back toward the river, pipe stem between his teeth, mind heavy with impressions. Antwerp, a port city, commerce, shipping, money. If Claire Vasseur had received letters from there, they were not likely sentimental. She was not a woman of romance. Her life was ordered, careful, with small indulgences but no extravagance. A mistake she could not correct. It sounded less like love and more like obligation, something that had followed her and refused to let go. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he found Lucas waiting with fresh notes. I asked about Leduc et Frères, Lucas said. They handle invoices for small exporters, textiles, machinery parts, sometimes shipping manifests, routine work. But one of their clients, 2 months ago, had a difficulty. A payment from Antwerp delayed. There was correspondence. Guess who typed it? Claire Vasseur, Maigret said flatly. Lucas nodded. And the man in the grey coat? Still no name. But Lognon swears someone matching him asked around the Saint-Lazare district. He wanted to know if a woman by her description took the train often. He was careful, but not careful enough. Saint-Lazare. Antwerp. A man in a grey coat tracing her movements. Maigret leaned back, pipe smoke wreathing around him. The picture was still blurred, but it was less mist now, more outline. Not passion, not sudden madness. Something patient, persistent, quietly suffocating. That evening, instead of going home, he returned to Rue de Turenne. The concierge blinked at him, surprised. No change, Chief Inspector. The room is as it was. I know, Maigret said. He went upstairs and sat once more in the chair by the table. He lit his pipe, filled the room with smoke, and listened. The sounds of the building seeped through the walls. Footsteps above, a baby's cry, a pot lid clattering. Life continued around her absence, and in the middle of it all, her silence seemed more pronounced. On the table, the cup with its film of coffee had darkened, the spoon still beside it. The scarf draped across the chair seemed almost to wait for her shoulders. The umbrella stood ready by the door. He stared at it a long while, then rose and opened it. Drops of water shook loose from the folds. It had been used last, then folded carefully, returned to its place. She had not left it behind by chance. She had placed it there deliberately, as if to say she would not need it again. He closed it, leaned it back in its corner, and stood for several minutes in silence. He was beginning to feel her decision, as if the room itself had absorbed it. Not panic, not violence. A choice made with resignation. When he left, the concierge looked at him expectantly, but Maigret offered only a heavy shrug. If she returns, let her find everything as it was. The streets outside were lit by lamps that glowed against the damp stones. He walked without hurry, pipe smoke trailing behind him, and let the city move at its pace. Something was pressing in now, like a tide about to break its edge. He felt it in the rhythm of his steps, in the stillness of the room he had just left. Claire Vasseur had not simply vanished. She had been drawn, piece by piece, into something larger than herself. Something that had followed her from Antwerp to Paris. Something she could neither escape nor admit. At home that night, Madame Maigret remarked that he was quieter than usual. She did not ask why. She placed the bread beside his plate, poured his beer, and let him sit in silence. At last, she said, in her calm way, "A woman does not buy a brioche for herself if she never eats it. She buys it for someone else." The remark landed softly but firmly. He puffed at his pipe without answering, but he felt the truth of it. The brioche, the matches, the umbrella. Small gestures, each revealing the shadow of another person. She had been preparing, leaving small signs for someone who might understand. When he went to bed, the streets outside were quiet. He lay awake longer than usual, thinking not of crime or guilt, but of a woman who had lived carefully until the day she could not. Somewhere, in the grey coat or the foreign letters, the mistake she could not correct waited, and soon, he knew, it would step out of the shadows and demand to be seen. In the morning, the wind had picked up, worrying the ends of posters and hurrying dust along the curbs, and the sky over the river hung the colour of pewter. Maigret crossed the Pont Marie with his collar up and his hat pulled low and went first not to Rue de Turenne, but to the post office on Rue Saint-Antoine, where the counters were high and the clerks had the slow patience of people who measured out other people's days. He stood a little back from the queue, pipe unlit, watching the rhythm. A woman paying a bill with coins counted twice. A workman sending a parcel wrapped in newspaper and string. A student with ink on his fingers buying one stamp as if it cost part of his future. When it was his turn, he asked for the chief clerk and did not sigh when he was told the chief clerk was at breakfast. He waited, hat in his hands, as if he had no authority that could be used to hurry anyone. The chief clerk, when he came, had a narrow face and a neat moustache like a ruled line. He recognized Maigret and did not pretend not to. They stood a little aside where the draught from the door didn't reach. Poste restante, Maigret said, as if remarking on the weather, for a woman who might be too careful for her own good. Claire Vasseur. The man's eyes went to the wall of pigeonholes as if the name might be written there. I cannot give names, Chief Inspector. It was said politely, with a precise weariness, like a rule recited so often it had become a prayer. I know, Maigret said. He let silence sit between them. But if a person receives small money orders from Antwerp, regular as a metronome, that is not a lover's whim. That is an arrangement. The clerk's moustache twitched, which in a man like that was almost an outburst. There are sometimes orders. Antwerp, Rotterdam, even Liège. Small amounts, 30 francs, 40. Some are collected by women who sign carefully and leave immediately. Some use the poste restante because they prefer not to have packages sent to their address. He didn't look at Maigret when he said it. I am not saying it is your person. No, Maigret said. You are not saying that. But I am saying, the clerk added after a fractional pause, that those who come for such things come on certain days, often Thursdays, between 8 and 9 in the evening, as if they had learned to step out of their lives for a minute and then step back in before anyone notices. Maigret inclined his head. And a woman with a neat hand who brings her own pen? The clerk permitted himself a small dry smile. Those sign more carefully than the others. He left with nothing he could put in a report, and yet something he could not ignore. Outside, the wind had scoured the streets almost clean. It tugged at his coat and set a sheet of newspaper skittering along ahead of him like a reluctant guide. He walked to the market by Rue Saint-Paul and stood long enough by a barrow of apples to seem a customer. He wasn't waiting for anything in particular. He was letting the city run its thumb along the edge of what he knew. By noon, he was back at the Quai des Orfèvres. Lucas had been out and returned with his ears reddened by the wind and his hair roughened into a small rebellion. Lognon at his best, he reported without sitting. He has found a landlady on Rue du Temple who remembers a tall, thin man with a grey coat and hair that shines as if he keeps it in a bottle. The man took a room twice a month and never stayed the night. Paid in cash, exact. Left no name, or rather left one that won't be his. Whom did he ask for? Maigret said. Not for anyone, Lucas said, but he asked where the nearest café with a view of the square was. The landlady said the Renard, and he said no, another, where the waiters do not look at you. Lucas looked up from his notes, and there's something else. A collection office on Rue de Tourbigot, a firm that recovers debts for shops who don't want to dirty their hands, employed a man with a careful moustache and careful French, foreign by the way he buttoned his coat. He asked about addresses near Place des Vosges, whether a Mademoiselle V had moved. "The stocky one," Maigret said, smoke gathering in the corner of his mouth. "He buys cigarettes like a Frenchman, but says each word as if it could break." Lucas nodded. They called him Rubens, which is not his name either. He said he represented a client in Antwerp with small sums outstanding, nothing serious, only a matter of settling accounts. "Nothing is serious when it is other people's lives," Maigret murmured. He got up then, his weight rising slowly as if the chair held him. "At 9 on Thursdays," he said, as much to himself as to Lucas, "and brioche on a day she did not eat it." In the afternoon he went again to Rue de Touraine, not to climb the stairs at once, but to stand across the street and look up at the windows. Madame Borel opened her shutter, looked out, saw him, and made a little show of surprise, as if fate had placed her there by accident and not the certainty of his return. He ignored her and watched the door until a boy came out of the bakery opposite with a bag under his arm and a cap set sideways in the manner of boys who have not yet learned their heads are not their own. Maigret crossed to the bakery and bought nothing, only asked the baker's wife whether children played in the square after supper. "They always play," she said, dusting flour from her hands, "until it rains too hard or their mothers remember them." "Does a woman sometimes give sweets or bread to one of them?" The baker's wife smiled with an indulgence that had learned to be suspicious. "They all do. It makes them feel less alone. There's a boy, Henri, the one with the cap too big, who waits near the 4th arcade because his mother works late at the hat shop on Rue des Francs Bourgeois. He knows how to make a face like an empty plate." Henri was at the square that evening, cap lower because the wind chased it, heels slapping stone. Maigret watched him run the length of one arcade, touch a column with a palm, and run back as if there were rules, and he was the referee. When he passed close, Maigret said his name gently, and the boy stopped with the narrow bravado of children who suspect they are about to be scolded and prefer to choose their punishment. "Your mother is at the hat shop," Maigret said. "You wait for her sometimes." Henri shrugged, which in a boy means yes. His eyes slid to the pipe with interest and back to the large face above it with caution. "A lady sometimes gives you a piece of brioche," Maigret said. Another shrug, but there was the ghost of a smile now. "She says I shouldn't eat so quick or I'll choke," he offered, as though that proved she was a serious person. "What does she look like?" "Like someone who doesn't want to be seen," the boy said, surprising himself with his own precision. "She sits where the wind can't get her, near the window of the cafe. She has a blue scarf sometimes. She doesn't talk much. She watches the fox." He pointed at the Café du Renard's painted sign with the animal who pretended to be cleverer than the patrons. "Did she ask you to do something?" Maigret asked. He kept his voice as if they were deciding between games. The boy hesitated and then produced, carefully, as if it were currency, a matchbox with a fox and a faint pencil mark on the tail. "She said if a gentleman asked for the fox, I should give him the one with the mark and he'd give me 5 francs for lemonade. But he didn't ask me. He took it from the table. He looked at me like a lamp-post." "The gentleman with the grey coat?" Henri's face did a small twist that meant yes. "He smells like the hair place," he said, "and like cold." "Did the lady cry?" Maigret asked after a moment in which he let the wind blow and a pigeon flap up from the stones as if it had found the question first. The boy looked at his own shoes. "Once. She didn't make the noise. It was like rain inside." Maigret put a coin in the boy's hand, without counting it, and said it was for not running too fast when the wind was behind him. He watched him go, light and sure, then crossed to the cafe. Inside, the waiter had grown less wary of him and more curious, which was worse for the waiter. He took the same table near the window where the glass rattled faintly when the wind angled just right. He set a matchbox on the table, unmarked, and ordered white wine. The hour between 8 and 9 passed with the small dramas of such places. a couple who had nothing left to say and ordered coffee to prolong their silence, a clerk who read the same paragraph of his paper twice and folded it as if that would change the news, a woman who looked too long into her empty glass, decided she had already decided, and left. At a few minutes past 9, the door opened and admitted a draught and a man who had learned to come in without bringing the outside with him. He was stocky, his moustache as careful as his coat, his hat brim pulled to the exact angle that said he knew the rules and had agreed to obey them in public. He smelled of a cologne that tried too hard to be French, and of tobacco that was not. His eyes went round the room without touching anything. They passed over Maigret, and then came back because they could not help it. He took the table nearest the counter, ordered in a French that had been practiced in mirrors, and put down a newspaper he didn't read. When the waiter brought his drink, he asked, too casually, if a lady with a blue scarf had been in. The waiter looked blank with an honesty that was almost insolent, and the man did not press. Maigret did not look at him again, and that was why the man looked at Maigret. There is a weight to a large man's silence that draws attention as surely as a shout. After a few minutes, the man rose, paid with exact change, the coin placed on the saucer as if he were making a small offering to gods he did not entirely respect, and as he turned, his sleeve brushed the corner of Maigret's table. The matchbox slid a little, and the man's eyes, as tidy as his mustache, dropped to it. For the fraction of a second, a hunter looks down at a track he will later deny he saw. Outside, the wind tugged at hats and made people walk with their heads tilted forward like penitents. The man went out into it with the care of someone who does not believe in weather. Maigret finished his wine, stood, put the matchbox in his pocket without looking at it, and left enough coins on the table to be remembered as generous and not suspected as curious. He did not follow. He stood under the arcade and watched the door of the café show him, for a few seconds at a time, the street and the corner, and then nothing. He lit his pipe with an unmarked match and felt the tobacco catch and settle. A woman who did not eat brioche had bought brioche and given it to a boy who knew how to wait. A woman who did not smoke had taken matches, marked them, and given them a task. A woman who closed doors twice had left hers half open so someone would see that something had interrupted her life mid-gesture. Between Antwerp and the square and a room with an umbrella in the corner, the shape was no longer only mist. It was a thing with a careful moustache and careful words, and another with hair that shone and a coat the color of ordinary weather. And the mistake she could not correct was not a single act, but a small agreement that had humiliated her a little each time she honored it. He turned his back to the wind and walked toward Rue de Turenne without deciding to. The house was as it had been, as houses are, indifferent to the drama of their tenants. The concierge peered up at him from his stool with the hope of a man who wishes to be told that his nerves are a form of intelligence. "Nothing," Maigret said, which was almost true. He climbed the stairs and stood a moment in the half-open doorway, not entering, as if he were keeping an appointment with the room. The umbrella stood where he had left it. The cup had darkened another shade. The scarf waited. He felt he could smell under the odor of dust and old coffee, and a room shut too long, the barest trace of brioche, which was impossible and therefore convincing. He went home late. Madame Maigret had kept supper warm without remark. He ate in silence, and she sat with her knitting making the small, industrious sounds that can be mistaken for peace. When he told her, without telling her, that a woman had given a boy a sweet and a signal, she said, still looking at her needles, "Some women make nests for other people with bits of their own life. It is not wise, but it is kind." He went to the window then and looked down at Boulevard Richard-Lenoir, where the trees, stripped of rain, still shivered. He stood until the pipe went out, and he did not relight it. Tomorrow he would go to Saint-Lazare, and not to the trains, but to the left luggage where people tried to keep time from touching their things, and then to a door on Rue du Temple, where a man with hair that shone had practiced leaving no name. and back to the post office on Rue Saint-Antoine between 8 and 9 on a Thursday to watch the women who signed with their own pens and went away quickly. He had not decided anything, but the city had decided for him. The next day, Maigret set out towards Saint-Lazare with the steady gait of a man who knew the city would not give up its secrets if chased. The station loomed as it always did, vast and weary, full of the clatter of boots and the smell of steam and coal. He entered not to look at the trains, but at the people around them. Clerks in dark coats, soldiers on leave, women tugging at children's hands, each face tired, each life urgent only to itself. He let himself be carried by the current to the left luggage counters, where men and women queued with parcels wrapped in brown paper or suitcases held together by rope. The clerk behind the counter was red-faced and impatient, already shuffling slips of paper as if to fend off delays before they occurred. Maigret waited, letting the queue shorten, then leaned his elbows on the worn wood. He spoke in the slow, even tone that was his own kind of patience. "Sometimes," he said, "a woman comes here who wishes not to carry her burdens home. Small packages, nothing more. A scarf, perhaps. A letter." The man glanced at him warily, saw the hat, the pipe, the bulk of a figure that suggested official weight. He grumbled, "We have dozens of such women, hundreds. They leave parcels and collect them. That is the business. But some come on Thursdays," Maigret said, smoke curling from his pipe, "between 8 and 9. They sign carefully. They never linger. A tall man sometimes waits a few paces back, never speaking, but watching." The clerk's mouth tightened. "You already know, then?" "I know a shadow," Maigret said. "I am waiting for it to have a face." The man hesitated, then drew a slip from a stack. "There is one. Always a small packet, wrapped tightly, no address written. She collects it, sometimes leaves another. Once there was a mark on the paper, a penciled cross. She did not think I saw." He looked at Maigret sharply. "What is she mixed in?" Maigret shook his head slowly. "Perhaps nothing. Perhaps only a mistake." He left the station and let his feet take him down toward the streets near Rue du Temple. The buildings there leaned together as if sharing secrets. He found the lodging house Lognon had mentioned, with its cracked shutters and its smell of cabbage boiled too long. The landlady peered out, suspicious until he gave his name, and then she shifted uneasily. "The man with the grey coat?" she said, her voice sharp. "He paid too precisely, never a cent more, never stayed the night. I didn't like him. He had a way of standing in the hall as if he were waiting for someone to follow him. Once I asked his name. He said it quickly, then smiled as if he had rehearsed it. It slipped off my memory like soap. That is why I know it was false." "Did he receive visitors here?" She shook her head. "Never. He left with nothing and returned with nothing. But once, when he came down the stairs, he dropped a paper. I picked it up. A receipt from Antwerp. Shipping office. I put it on the table. He saw it and looked at me as if I had touched a nerve. He took it without a word and left." Maigret let her talk on, not interrupting. She had little else to offer, but her voice carried the flavor of unease that lingered after certain kinds of lodgers. When he left, she watched him go with relief. By evening he was back at the post office on Rue Saint-Antoine. He waited outside under the lamps as people passed in and out, some with parcels, some with letters clutched against their coats. At a few minutes past 8, he saw her. Not Claire Vasseur herself, but a woman of the same careful sort. Modest coat, scarf tied neatly, movements precise. She signed at the counter with her own pen, accepted a small packet, and left without looking right or left. He followed her only to the corner, noting her quick steps, the way she folded the packet into her bag as if hiding it even from herself. She disappeared into the metro. He did not pursue. Instead, he lit his pipe and stood under the drizzle that had begun again, thinking. There were others like her, surely. Women who lived quiet, ordered lives, yet carried small burdens for someone else. Errands for which they were paid little, in money or in relief from fare. Antwerp, foreign cigarettes, letters that came too regularly. It was not grand crime, not conspiracy, but something smaller and more corrosive. A web of minor traffics that caught people like Claire Vasseur, who had only wished to keep their lives modest and untouched. He returned home late, his shoes damp, his coat heavy. Madame Maigret looked up from her mending as he entered. She did not ask where he had been. She poured him beer, set it beside him, and after a while said, "It is always women, isn't it? Not the strong ones or the reckless ones, the ones who are careful. They are the ones who break." He said nothing, but her words stayed with him. The next morning he sent Lucas to Antwerp by telegram, asking for information on small shipping firms, on names linked with Le Duc et Frères, on men with grey coats and Dutch cigarettes. He gave no explanation, only asked for patterns. Then he walked again to Rue de Touraine. The boarding house seemed more silent than before, as if the absence had deepened into certainty. Madame Borel greeted him in the hall, her eyes bright with the hunger of gossip. "Still nothing," she said, almost gleeful. "It is unnatural. Something has happened. You know it." He let her words wash over him without reply. He climbed the stairs and stood once more in the doorway of the half-open room. The umbrella still waited, the scarf still draped, the cup still darkened. He felt the weight of the silence pressing as if the room were holding its breath. He stepped inside and sat. He did not move for a long while. He smoked slowly, filling the air with the heavy scent of his pipe. He thought of the boy Henri in the marked matchbox. He thought of the stocky man with his careful French, of the tall one with his shining hair. He thought of the women at the post office, each carrying her small packet as if it were a secret shame. And he thought of Claire Vasseur, who had lived quietly until the day her habits broke. The brioche bought and given away, the matches marked, the umbrella left behind. Small signs like crumbs dropped for someone to follow. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and the floor creaked beneath his weight. The sound seemed loud in the silence. He knew now that the door half open was no accident. It was her message, as plain as she dared leave it. Something had come for her, and she had gone to meet it. Not willingly, not unwillingly, but with the resignation of one who believed her mistake could not be undone. He sat until the pipe went out, and then he rose, heavily. The city would give him the rest in its own time. But already the shape of the truth was forming, and it was not a dramatic truth, not a sudden blow of violence. It was a quieter thing, the slow erosion of a life until one day a woman no longer shut her door. The following day began grey and close, a low sky pressing down over Paris as though the city were being asked to keep its voice lowered. Maigret walked with his usual deliberate pace along the quay, his coat heavy and pipe unlit, letting the air settle into him before the day began in earnest. He had slept poorly, not from agitation, but from the weight of thoughts that had refused to arrange themselves. The case was still not a case, not officially. No complaint had been filed, no crime established, and yet the silence of Mademoiselle Vasseur's room, the umbrella leaning like a rebuke, had convinced him that the truth was already here in the city, waiting to be heard. When he arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres, Lucas was waiting with a telegram spread across his desk. The paper was thin, the words blunt. Antwerp police reported that a small forwarding firm, Van der Meulen and Company, had recently been investigated for questionable dealings. False invoices, debts disguised as shipping charges, letters sent to clerks and minor employees in Paris who signed papers without understanding what they were made party to. One of those clerks, they noted, was named Claire Vasseur. Maigret sat heavily in his chair, pipe stem between his teeth, eyes on the telegram, though he did not need to read it again. It was not a grand scheme, not a conspiracy fit for headlines. It was small, almost petty. But it was enough. A quiet woman in a modest office had been drawn into something, had signed her name where she should not, and that had been her mistake. The mistake she had told her sister she could not correct. Lucas waited, as if for instructions, but Maigret only puffed at his pipe until the smoke hung thick. At last he said, "The grey one presses her. The stocky one makes sure the money moves. Between them they keep her caught. And one day she decides she can no longer sign, or she cannot pay what they demand, and the door stays half open." In the afternoon he walked again to Rue de Turenne. The concierge rose at once from his stool, eager as a dog. "Still nothing, Chief Inspector. My wife swears she heard a step, but it was a dream." Maigret only nodded and went upstairs. He did not sit this time, but stood in the middle of the room, turning slowly, letting his eyes pass once more over each object. The scarf, the cup, the umbrella, the wardrobe with its dresses, modest, worn, the postcard of Étretat. He thought of her life, the careful habits, the precise movements, the small comforts that made a narrow existence bearable. And then the foreign letters, the men in grey coats, the money that came like drops of water. He could almost feel her resolve breaking, quietly, invisibly, until one evening she no longer closed her door. When he descended, Madame Borel was waiting in her doorway. She began at once, her voice sharp with certainty. "You'll find nothing. She's gone. Women who leave their doors open do not return." "Perhaps," Maigret said mildly. He did not add that sometimes they returned in silence, with eyes that refused to meet others. He walked slowly back to the Place des Vosges. The square was quiet under the low sky. At the Café du Renard, the waiter greeted him with a look of resignation, as if he had grown used to the inspector's presence. Maigret ordered wine and sat by the window. He did not question, he did not press. He only sat, pipe in hand, watching the door. It was nearly 9 when the stocky man entered. His mustache was as precise as ever, his coat buttoned just so. He ordered quickly, eyes flicking around the room. When they met Maigret's gaze, they paused only a fraction, but it was enough. He drank half his glass, then left as suddenly as he had come. Maigret did not follow immediately. He let a quarter of an hour pass, then rose, paid, and stepped into the square. The night air was damp, carrying the faint smell of wet leaves. He walked with his heavy, unhurried stride, and at the corner of Rue de Turenne he saw the man again, speaking in low tones to someone half hidden in the shadows. A tall figure, hair catching what little light there was, a grey coat blending with the night. The two men stood close, their words hurried, sharp. Maigret stayed back, pipe between his teeth, his bulk half concealed by the doorway of a shuttered shop. He did not need to hear the words. He could read the tension in their gestures, the way the stocky one jabbed a finger, the way the tall one shrugged with a disdain that did not mask unease. A quarrel, quiet but fierce, the kind born not of loyalty but of necessity. Then the tall one turned abruptly and walked away, his steps echoing on the stones. The stocky one remained a moment longer, then too disappeared into the night. Maigret stayed where he was, unmoving, until the street emptied. Then he walked back to the boarding house, climbed once more to the room, and stood in the half-open doorway. The silence pressed on him more heavily than ever. He knew then that Claire Vasseur would not return, not because she had been taken by force, but because she had already surrendered. To fear, to shame, to the weight of a mistake too small for the world to notice, but too large for her to bear. Back at Boulevard Richard Lenoir, Madame Maigret was setting the table. She looked up as he entered, her face calm, expectant. He hung his coat, set down his hat, and sat. She placed bread and stew before him. After a long silence, he said, almost to himself, she left her door half open so someone would see. Not the concierge, not the neighbors. Someone who could understand. Madame Maigret poured his beer and said nothing. She did not need to. Later, as he sat by the window, pipe in hand, He thought again of the boy Henri with his too large cap, of the marked matchbox, of the scarf, the brioche, the umbrella. Small, human signs, each one a fragment of a story she had not dared to tell aloud. He exhaled smoke into the night and let the silence settle around him. Soon, perhaps, the men in the grey coats would be found, their debts and invoices exposed, their names taken down in reports. But for Claire Vasseur, none of it would matter. Her mistake had been ordinary, human, and it had been enough to end her. And so Maigret sat in the darkened room, listening to the faint hum of Paris beyond the glass, heavy with the knowledge that not every case ended with arrests or confessions. Some ended with silence, with a door left half open, with the quiet absence of someone who had tried too hard to live carefully in a world that noticed too little. Morning pressed low over the city, dull and close, as if Paris had put on an extra layer and meant to keep it. Maigret walked without hurry to the Quai des Orfèvres, his coat carrying the smell of last night's damp, the stem of his pipe resting in the corner of his mouth. Lucas was already at his desk, sleeves pushed up, a pencil behind one ear, as if the pencil might hear more quickly than he could. He looked up without speaking and slid a scrap of paper across the blotter. "From Antwerp again," he said after a moment. "Van der Meulen have a man they use here when the sums are small and the hands must be clean. A Belgian with a French name for work and another for coffee. They call him Rubens sometimes Roland. Stocky, careful. Careful moustache," Maigret murmured, pocketing the paper without reading it. "And the other?" "Tall, thin, hair like a varnished chair," Lucas said, not smiling. "They say he does the talking when talking is all that's needed, and the leaving when leaving must be done quickly. He's supposed not to exist at all." Maigret sat down heavily and let the chair take some of his weight. He didn't speak for a while. When he did, it was almost to himself. If a woman like Claire Vasseur is asked to sign something once, she protests. If she's asked twice, she worries. By the third time, she tells herself that it is already done. He tamped his pipe with a thumb. "Find Longnon. Tell him nothing that would make him hopeful. Ask him to have the waiter at the Renard forget how to lie." He left shortly after, the scrape of his chair on the boards softer than it looked. He did not walk toward Rue de Touraine. He went instead to the little café near St. Paul where men sat with a glass too early and a hat too low. He drank coffee that had been kept warm too long and watched the door without watching it. The city has a way of delivering, but only to those who behave as if they expect nothing. By late afternoon he let himself drift back to the Place des Vosges. Under the arcades, the air smelled of damp stone and the faint, greasy sweetness of chestnuts roasting. The Café du Renard breathed out warmth and the soft clink of spoons. He took the same table by the window and set his hat beside him, the brim still moist. The waiter came as if drawn by habit and set down a glass of white wine without asking, which meant he had decided to cooperate without being accused of doing so. "You said a man asked last night," Maigret said, lifting the matchbox, unmarked, and turning it in his fingers. "Stocky, mustache, foreign French. If he comes again, bring him the fox." The waiter squinted. "The fox?" "The marked one." Maigret's voice was mild. "You knew there was a mark before I told you. You'll bring it as if by mistake. He will believe it is by chance. Men like that always believe in their own good fortune." The waiter went away, looking as if he would prefer to serve a storm rather than this. Outside, the square turned from the grey of pewter to the cautious black of early night. People walked more quickly, their steps counting down to soup and lamps and voices they knew. At 8:45, the door admitted a draught and the stocky man with the moustache that made a rule of his face. He shook himself minutely, a man who disliked the weather for behaving like weather, and took a table near the counter. The waiter, as if obeying a bell, came with a pack of cigarettes and laid, carelessly, convincingly, beside it a box of matches with a little penciled cross on the fox's tail. The man's hand paused. It did not reach at once. It hovered and then, in a movement that pretended to be nothing, took the box and slipped it beneath his palm. He looked into the room. His gaze slid over Maigret the way a cautious man avoids the edge of a curb he can't see the bottom of. He finished his drink quickly and rose. He left exact change, as always, as if exactness could protect him from the untidiness of events. Maigret paid without haste and stood, set his hat at an angle that kept the mist out of his eyes, and followed at a distance that did not need measuring. The man walked along the arcade, then cut out into the square, then into a narrower street where shutters were already pulling thoughts inward. At a corner he paused, looked behind him, decided against something, decided for something else, and continued. He made for Rue de Turenne, then passed it by, as if even his feet preferred not to be reminded of that door half open. On Rue Saint-Antoine, he stopped beneath an awning and consulted his watch with controlled impatience. "Evening," Maigret said from the shelter of his own bulk. The man started with the annoyance of someone whose nerves are rented rather than owned. He looked up. The mustache tried to stand on its dignity. The eyes went down at once to the inspector's pipe, as if hoping to address the lesser authority. "Good evening," he said, his French careful where it did not need to be. "Roland," Maigret said, not as a question, "or Rubens when you wish to be admired." "I don't know you," the man said, which in such mouths means he knows too much. "You know the fox," Maigret said, holding out his hand. The matchbox lay in the palm like a small confession. The man's mouth tightened. "I don't carry children's toys," he said. He made to move. Maigret did not touch him. He did not need to. He only stood so that the street had less room than before. "We'll walk," Maigret said. "You will come to the quay. You will tell me a story that makes you less important than you wish to be and less guilty than you are frightened of being. I will not interrupt. We will both be polite." For a moment the man's pupils widened, then shrank again to their careful pinpoints. He shrugged, a movement that tried to be Gallic and failed at the last buttonhole. "If you insist," he said with a humility learned in offices where the chairs were never comfortable. They did not hurry. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the corridors were warmer than the air and smelled of paper and people. In the small room where he sometimes spoke to those who needed to speak, Maigret did not sit behind the desk. He took the chair against the wall, not quite facing the man, and filled his pipe with the ritual that was both a courtesy and an insistence. Rollin, if that was the name he had chosen for this hour, sat with his knees neatly together and his hat on his lap, as if the hat were a protection against ideas. He looked at the floor first, then at the door, then at Maigret, as though deciding which would be the least unwise to address. "I collect small sums," he began, before he had been asked. "Very small. People forget to pay. Shops tire of asking. A firm engages me because I do not make scenes. I speak softly. I show papers. It is not noble. It is not wicked." "You speak also to women at post offices," Maigret said neutrally. "You ask waiters about blue scarves. You know Antwerp better than the quay at Bercy." Roland spread his hands. "Antwerp, Paris. What is a city? I speak where a client writes." He hesitated. Sometimes papers must be signed by those who understand only their own names. And those who bring the papers stand a little apart, Maigret said. "Tall, grey, hair that has learned to shine. Does he also have a name for work and another for coffee?" Roland's mouth tried out a shape and then let it go. "De Smet," he said at last, cautious and quick. "Or Desmet, if you wish to be French about it. He comes when someone has stopped being sensible." Stopped signing. Roland looked at the hat on his knees. "Stopped paying," he corrected, and then immediately stopped believing that paying would end it. They let that sit between them, like a plate neither wished to clear. The stove ticked as it cooled. Somewhere, a door shut in the corridor, with the resigned sound of a door that has never expected to remain open. "Claire Vasseur," Maigret said softly. Roland's face changed very little. The change was in the way he did not swallow. "A clerk," he said. "Precise. She signed where she was told. Once. Twice. Then there was a delay. Costs increase when men are paid to wait. She took an advance that was not an advance. She thought—" He broke off, not dramatically, simply because deception came less easily when the room was this warm. "She thought it would be the last time," Maigret said. Roland looked up, and for the first time his eyes, which had always been the least committed feature of his face, looked as if they belonged to him. You know how such lives are. The small coin that fills a small hole and leaves a smaller one that must be filled again. She was ashamed of how ordinary it all was. She was not ashamed at first. Shame is a luxury. It comes later. Maigret did not ask if he had threatened her. He knew the answer, which was yes and no. Men like Roland did their threatening by placing papers on tables and straightening them. "She told you she could not correct it," he said instead. "She told me nothing," Roland replied with sudden heat, which surprised him. "She told herself, and I listened to a woman who had already decided." He looked at his hands, turned the hat. "She asked for time. I gave her a week I could not afford. The other disapproved. He asked me whether I had become a charity. He is a man who has never given away even a mistake." "And then?" Roland's shoulders made a movement that looked like a shiver someone had tried to iron out. "She sent word, not to me, never to me, that she would bring a packet on Thursday to the place with the fox. Not money, papers, receipts, perhaps a letter for Antwerp. I thought she meant to settle accounts in a way that could be counted. He said we would take what was given and not wait for what was promised." He pressed his fingertips together as if to keep them from saying more. "She did not come." The room held its warmth like a secret. Maigret watched the man's face without watching it. Silence domesticated the air. He asked, after a long time, where would he go when people did not come? Roland answered too quickly, and therefore honestly. "Saint-Lazare, not for trains, the lockers. He likes the feel of a key that does not belong to him." He hesitated, then added, "He has a number that pleases him." "Numbers please him more than names." Maigret stood. The chair accepted his leaving without complaint. He put on his hat and took his coat from the peg. Roland did not rise. He looked at the door as if it were a test he had not prepared for. "You will stay here," Maigret said. "You will enjoy our stove and our coffee that tastes of stoves. You will consider whether a careful man can afford to forget exactly how careful he has been." At Saint-Lazare, the noise came in waves, broken by announcements that did not lower the volume so much as rearrange it. The left luggage counter was as it had been, slips of paper, tired faces, a pen tied to its chain with a knot that had outlived the man who tied it. The clerk, who had been red-faced yesterday, was redder now, but when Maigret asked for the supervisor, he went without argument. A policeman's hat opens small doors more easily than large ones. The supervisor listened, looked into a ledger that seemed to disapprove of being necessary, and led him down a corridor that smelled of cold metal and old string. The lockers sat in a long row like obedient soldiers. Numbers marched. Somewhere near the middle, a number that had no reason to be different, looked different because someone had said it would. The key turned with a small reluctance, as if keys preferred not to be complicit. The door opened to reveal a handbag of the modest kind one buys when one has decided not to buy the other kind. It was brown, scuffed, and closed. He did not open it at once. He stood with it in his hands, feeling the weight that was not the bag's weight, but the weight of what it would and would not contain. He opened it finally on the supervisor's desk under the gaze of a pen that had been used to write more disappointments than celebrations. Inside, neatly arranged, were a wallet with a few francs, an identity card in the name of Claire Vasseur, 2 tram tickets clipped together, a small parcel wrapped in brown paper with twine tied into a knot that someone had learned by watching their mother, and a set of keys on a string. The keys were ordinary. One could have opened a door twice. He lifted them and felt the cool of them in his palm. At the bottom, lodged as if to be forgotten and therefore remembered, a matchbox lay, the fox's tail marked again by a pencil's faint insistence. He put it back, closed the bag, and stood a moment longer, his breath making a cloud that dissolved against the station's draught. He returned to the quay as the evening gathered itself. Rollin sat where he had been left, the hat still on his knees, as if the hours had passed around him without touching him. He looked up with a hunger he tried to pretend was merely curiosity. Maigret set the handbag on the table, not between them, but a little to the side, as if it were a third person who might speak when it was ready. "Where?" Rollin asked, and then, because the question had betrayed him, "I mean, how do we proceed?" "We proceed by not hurrying what cannot be hurried," Maigret said. "You will tell me about Thursday last. Not the parts you have said already, the parts you did not say because you told yourself they were unimportant." Rollin's hands tightened on the brim. He didn't answer. For a long time he listened to the stove tick and the pen scratch in the next room. Then something in his face seemed to let go, the way a knot decides it will permit itself to be untied. "She sent a message," he said. "Not to me, to the boy, the one with the cap that does not fit. He was to tell me, if I asked for the fox, that the packet would be where the numbers sleep. I did not ask. He told me anyway because he is a child, and children do not believe in adult arrangements. I went too late. The locker was not opened. Perhaps she had opened it and closed it again. Perhaps she could not decide between one door and another." He looked at the handbag and then away, as if he had glimpsed a mirror that had added years without permission. He, de Smet, said it was no matter, that such people always return in the end. He said we would give her until Sunday, because Sunday is when people make bargains with themselves. Maigret did not move. He could feel in the way the man spoke now, the place where bravado had tired itself out and left only the thing itself. "She won't come," Rollin said, very low. "You know it. Even if she breathes, she won't come. Some doors, once they have been left ajar, do not learn to close again." Outside, night had become proper night. The river moved without showing its movement. In Rue de Turenne, a room held a scarf, a cup, an umbrella, and a silence that had learned to have weight. Maigret sat with his big hands loose on his knees and did not instruct anyone to bring paper or write names. There would be time for that. For now, the handbag on the table and the keys on the string and the small parcel with its honest knot were enough to turn the city a degree toward the place where it would, at last, say the rest. The morning after, the sky over Paris was pale and brittle, the kind that promised cold more than rain. Maigret left his apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir a little earlier than usual, his pipe unlit in his pocket, his coat heavy with the weight of the last days. He walked without hurry toward the Quai des Orfèvres, feeling the city stir around him. Milkmen unloading crates, a baker's boy whistling without conviction, the distant rattle of trams. Paris went on, indifferent as always, while one woman's absence lingered like smoke that refused to lift. In his office, the handbag found at Saint-Lazare sat on the corner of the desk. The keys, the tram tickets, the carefully wrapped parcel, the marked matchbox, each one modest, ordinary, yet together they spoke more loudly than any confession. Lucas came in with the weariness of a man who had been awake too long. He set down a note. Antwerp confirmed what they already knew. Van der Meulen and company was finished. The fraud was exposed, papers seized, men arrested. The grey figure, de Smet, had vanished in the shuffle, but his description was already moving from desk to desk, border to border. Rollin sat downstairs, still waiting for a fate he could not quite name. He had told his story, and in telling it he had diminished himself, no longer the careful collector, merely a man who had mistaken precision for safety. He would be processed, charged, perhaps, but he had already confessed the more serious truth, that he had known her struggle, seen her breaking, and continued anyway. As for Claire Vasseur, the truth was less clear, though Maigret no longer expected clarity. The trail had ended not with a body, not with violence, but with a handbag in a locker and a door left half open. She had chosen, quietly, to step out of her life. Whether she had boarded a train, sought refuge in another quarter, or simply walked into silence, no one could yet say. The city was large enough to absorb such disappearances, and the sea beyond it larger. Still Maigret sat with his heavy bulk pressed into the chair, pipe finally lit, smoke curling against the pale morning light. He thought of the scarf left on the chair, the umbrella waiting by the door, the brioche handed to the boy Henri, the penciled mark on the fox's tail. Small gestures, ordinary things, yet each one a fragment of her last message to the world. Not a cry for help, but a kind of resignation, the way people sometimes leave a window ajar when they know they will not return. By late afternoon, when the paperwork began to pile and voices in the corridor grew louder, he rose. He walked again to Rue de Touraine, not out of duty, but because the place drew him. The concierge blinked up at him, eager for news, but Maigret only shook his head. He climbed the stairs slowly and stood once more in the half-open doorway. The room had not changed, the cup darkened, the scarf draped, the umbrella waiting. But now it felt less like evidence and more like memory, as if the objects themselves had given up their story. He closed the door gently, this time all the way, and left the key with the concierge. "If she returns," he said, "give her back her room exactly as it was." That evening at home, Madame Maigret served him a simple supper. She said nothing until he had finished, then remarked, almost casually, "It is a pity to live so carefully all one's life, only to vanish because of something so small." He nodded, his face unreadable in the lamplight. Later, with a glass of beer in hand, he sat by the window and looked out at the boulevard. The trees stood bare against the night sky, the lamps glowing softly through the mist. He puffed at his pipe, letting the smoke drift, and thought of Claire Vasseur, a woman who had left her door half open, who had once said she had made a mistake she could not correct. The city moved on outside. Trams, footsteps, voices. And Maigret sat quietly, heavy and patient, knowing that some mysteries did not end with an arrest or a confession. Some ended with silence, with a door left ajar, with the faint trace of a life that had been lived carefully until it could be lived no more. He drank his beer slowly, watching the smoke dissolve into the lamplight, and let the silence close around him, 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 close around him.